Hello Internet, my name is Camille, I have a GM's Guide, and this is that GM's Guide, but instead of regular, it's on YouTube. And today, we're talking about Hexcrawls. Possibly the largest scope, the king of all campaign structures. These take a lot of time to prepare, but they can be worth it, especially if you like a game about exploration. One of humanity's defining impulses is exploration and discovery, and Hexcrawls primarily cater to that. Hexcrawls are all about going to new places and finding new things until you have explored and documented a previously undiscovered wilderness, like you were Lewis and Clark but with manticores, and then broken into the homes of and subsequently massacred any native populations you find to be inconvenient, like you were Andrew Jackson but with goblins. The difference between a Hexcrawl and a wilderness campaign is that a wilderness campaign places the emphasis firmly on lurking evils threatening to overwhelm civilization. If the status of other regions is totally unknown, that's mainly an issue of reconnaissance, with potential dangers lurking underneath a fog of war, dangers that can be assumed to eventually come to your house and eat your lunch. In Wilderness Campaign, you are being invaded. A Hexcrawl places the emphasis on exploration. You aren't being invaded, so there's time to stick your nose in everything just to see what's there. The wilderness may well be full of dangerous things, but those things aren't particularly imperialistic and probably won't become a problem for your homeland anytime in the foreseeable future. You don't explore to reveal threats, you explore because you want to know what's in that hex. There might be some other quests involved. Maybe you're trying to recover artifacts stolen from your kingdom and scattered throughout the wilderness. Maybe you're mapping the area for future resettlement. Maybe you're exploring a newly discovered wilderness to try and make allies amongst the locals and convince them to join your fantasy federation. You don't have to be an imperial terrible person in a Hexcrawl campaign. Ultimately, though, players are exploring. And whatever the main plot is, it shouldn't make them feel bad about sticking their nose into every hex on the map just to see what's in there. In other words, that thing the Ubisoft game does sometimes, where there's a countdown clock to Armageddon, but then they set you loose in a map and you chase collectibles and unrelated side quests for 5 hours before you remember that whole demonic invasion thing. Don't do that. Now, the process of traveling from one hex to another is a process. It can take 5 to 10 minutes, and it's a lot of die rolling and assigning rolls and taking notes, and may include a random encounter that will take up another 15 or 20 minutes on top of that. You can cut down a lot on this by drastically oversimplifying the process, but you shouldn't, partly because each step involved adds important options to travel that at some point your PCs will want to take advantage of. Like, you could simplify things by limiting all hex travel to fixed speeds, but at some point PCs will want to get on a horse and ride through the night in order to make it to their destination before some terrible calamity occurs, and there is no particularly good reason why they shouldn't be able to do that. But secondly, and most importantly, this process makes for some good winding down time between hex encounters and adventures. The important corollary to that is that most hexes the party enters should have enough stuff in them to justify a 5 to 10 minute simmering down period afterwards. At least 70% of all hexes should contain, at minimum, a significant encounter that will hopefully take at least half an hour to resolve. The remainder should have at least some kind of feature or landmark to them just so that each hex has something to discover, even if it's just an ancient wizard's tower that is now completely, genuinely empty or something. And again, these kinds of things shouldn't be more than 30% of the Hexcrawl at maximum, and preferably less than that. The party shouldn't be spending more than a quarter of the session just walking places, even in a Hexcrawl where walking places is the selling point. So they should have a high probability that after going through the process of traveling from one hex to another, there will be something interesting in that hex. This means that when you make a Hexcrawl, you are committing yourself to creating quite a few encounters and adventures. A 6x6 Hexcrawl, that's about the minimum size you need before it starts to feel like exploring a prison cell, that has 36 hexes in it. That means you need at least 26 encounters, or better yet, full adventures to place in those hexes, and you'll probably want at least one urban crawl town somewhere to use as a home base. We'll talk about urban crawls in a little bit. But that urban crawl is probably going to be at least 2 or 3 adventures, or adventures worth of material depending on how you distribute it. The average published adventure has an average of about 3 main encounters in it, which means that a 6x6 Hexcrawl has approximately, counting those urban crawl adventures, a dozen adventures worth of material minimum. That's a full campaign, and it's also the minimum size of a Hexcrawl, so definitely think carefully before making your Hexcrawl any bigger. If you use 30-mile hexes, which seems like an odd size at first glance, but we'll talk about that in a bit too, a 6x6 Hexcrawl is about the size of the entire island of Ireland, including Northern Ireland, the modern nation of Austria, the American state of South Carolina, or the Japanese island of Hokkaido. In other words, it's the size of a respectable medieval kingdom and thus perfectly suited for a complete D&D campaign from low to mid levels. High levels usually go to some lower plane to stab Satan in the face, or you go underwater to fight the Sahuagin Queen or something, so the Hexcrawl usually expires at that point. You can get larger than 6x6, much larger if you're particularly ambitious. A 6x6 Hexcrawl is large enough for the average published campaign, but the average published campaign lasts less than a year in play. 5th edition releases them about as fast as the average group can complete them, and their release schedule is twice annually. An 8x8 Hexcrawl is about the size of Greece, the nation of England and Wales combined, the state of Illinois, or the Liaoning province of China. This will require at least 15 adventures worth of content in hexes, and if you still have only one major city, close to 20 adventures worth total, which is close to a year's worth of play. Not England is the setting for quite a few medieval fantasy stories, so this is also a pretty defensible size, although not recommended if it's your first time at doing a Hexcrawl. Now, if you want to add in Scotland for the entire island of Great Britain, you will need a 10x10 Hexcrawl, although the actual island of Great Britain wouldn't be a 10x10 square, it would be more stretched vertically, but it would be the same total number of hexes, about 100, which is about 21 adventures worth in the hexes, plus you're probably going to want at least 2 cities at this point, probably 3, which means you're looking at over 30 adventures, which is definitely going to take at least a year to play, and we haven't even added in an Ireland yet. We're far behind the size of Germany or Japan, both of which are in the neighborhood of 13x13, and we're even further behind France, which is 16x16, and France is probably the absolute limit of how big you can make a Hexcrawl, and France was quite large for a medieval kingdom. Going larger than 10x10 is generally not advised. Even a 6x6 is plenty big for most purposes. And it's theoretically plausible to go as large as 16x16, but it will be monumental both in creating it and running it, so it's only recommended for dedicated groups who want to play very long-term exploration campaigns. And there's nothing stopping you from stringing different campaign types together if you'd like to keep playing the same characters, so even if you do want a very long campaign, it still might be wiser to run, say, an 8x8 Hexcrawl, and then have the characters move to a different location where they have a wilderness campaign, or an intrigue campaign, or whatever. If you really want to explore a France's worth of hexes, though, 16x16 is doable, if you're committed. Now we need to figure out what kind of encounters or adventures we put in a Hexcrawl. Hexes can obviously contain complete adventures, and you should have at least a few of those lying around. Multi-level dungeons and mysteries are by far the most obvious and easiest to do. Wilderness journeys are generally speaking incongruous with a Hexcrawl, but you can make it work. A multi-day journey makes little sense in the confines of a single hex, because, you can travel to a whole different hex in that time. But wilderness journey mechanics work just as well for a short journey through an area densely packed with danger. For example, if there's a hidden temple in a forest thick with dark fae, you could use a wilderness journey adventure for getting through the forest to the temple. It might only take 5 or 6 hours instead of several days or weeks, but it's still a wilderness journey. Mass combats are also a strange sort of adventure to have in a Hexcrawl because the party might discover the adventure, walk away from it for weeks or months, and then come back, and it's odd the military situation hasn't shifted at all. I've never really been satisfied with any mass combat system anyway, although Matt Colville has an expanded one coming out, so we'll see how that one turns out. In any case, some hexes might indeed be home to some kind of military stalemate or Cold War that won't change until the players arrive to tip the balance one way or the other, and others might simply be home to a large army of enemy monsters, such that clearing the hex requires players to gather up an army of their own and drive them off, but usually a mass combat is a bad idea for a hex adventure. Complete adventures are big and take a lot of time to both design and play, and there's no reason to make all 70%, or preferably more, of your significant hex encounters include them. All that a hex encounter absolutely needs is a hook, a bit of build-up, and then an encounter for payoff. As such, it's acceptable for a hex encounter to be a simple 2-scene mystery in which you have a hook that immediately draws the player's attention, the burned-out remains of a caravan, for example, 3 clues that all point towards the same climax scene, and then in that scene there's a confrontation with whoever sacked the caravan, some goblins in a cave or whatever. 1-page dungeons with just 4 or 5 encounters make for good hex fodder. You can look up Matt Colville's video on how to make a 1-page dungeon, and that general formula can be repeated a couple of times without getting old, so long as you don't put any of those 1-page dungeons immediately adjacent to one another, so players don't get them one right after the other. Now, once you get used to designing these relatively brief encounters, it becomes easy. Then the trick is to come up with enough new ideas that it doesn't become stale. Any adventure you've had fun running or playing can probably be converted to work as a hex encounter. Adventure paths can often be chopped up and have their pieces planted into a Hexcrawl like a macabre garden. Generic dungeons like the Temple of Elemental Evil or the Keep on the Borderlands can be dropped into practically any setting. Material from entirely different games like Warhammer 40k, Warhammer Fantasy RPGs, the Star Wars RPGs, the One Ring RPG, Call of Cthulhu even, those can often be adapted. Material from totally different media can provide the ideas needed to create encounters or adventures from scratch. You can mine books, movies, and games for plot hooks or setting ideas. BioShock is about an underwater society gone mad due to the corrosive psychological effects of superpower-granting drugs, and that's easy fodder for a D&D dungeon crawl at the bottom of the sea. The Terminator is about a nigh-invincible assassin sent to kill a hapless victim, one so powerful that he must be evaded and worn down over multiple encounters, rather than simply confronted and killed, and that works just as well for a single-minded super golem as it does for a robot assassin from the future. Alien is about being stalked by a monster that will 100% kill you if it catches you alone and unawares, but will be more vulnerable if confronted by a large and prepared group, making it a game of trying to find the monster without being separated and picked off. The sequel movie, Aliens, is about fighting those same monsters, foregoing the whole hidden stalker thing and just Zerg rushing the party through the air ducts. And when you inevitably run out of ideas or energy for the project, just give it a few weeks to simmer and then come back to it. Hexcrawls of any appreciable size will take a long time to prepare, so don't expect to get it all done in a week between Session 0 and the start of the campaign. It's surely possible to hammer out 3 shoddy encounters a day and jam them all into a 6x6 hexcrawl, but it won't be any fun. A hexcrawl is also going to require a random encounter table. This table should be a D100, but you're going to roll it on each and every hex the party enters, so don't be afraid to stock large parts of it with nothing happens. Each major region of the hexcrawl should have its own random encounter table, with each random encounter table covering no more than about 40 hexes. This means that it's fine if your 6x6 hexcrawl has only a single encounter table, but an 8x8 should have at least 2, and a 10x10 should have at least 3. And regions don't necessarily have to be contiguous. You might have a plains table, a hills table, and a forest table for something resembling medieval Britain or France, and none of those regions would be particularly contiguous. Splitting things up by terrain often makes more sense than splitting things up by political boundaries, but sometimes it makes a big difference whether it's the Knights of Solamnia or the Knights of Naraka who are patrolling the region. Pick whichever is more appropriate for the hexcrawl you're running. So, you've got a bunch of encounters and adventures out there in the big unexplored wilderness, you've set your party down in their starting hex, and now they would like to go to an adjacent hex. How are we doing that? Traveling from one hex to another is a 10-step process, but many of the steps are just check to see if X is happening, where the answer is usually that no, X is not happening, so you just skip it. There's a checklist in the written version of the guide, and it's recommended that you print it out and use it as an actual checklist. If you have a GM screen and any part of that screen is not already occupied with information you actually use regularly, tape the hexcrawl checklist over that part of the GM screen for as long as you're running a hexcrawl. Otherwise, just make sure it's as handy as your monster stats or your adventure outlines. This checklist is optimized for speed resolution. Trying to remember all 10 steps off the top of your head will slow things down, and often doing them out of order will require redoing steps you did earlier than you were supposed to. The process of traveling from one hex to another is meant to be the first stage of building tension towards the climax of whatever encounter is found in the next hex, but doing it from memory instead of building tension just builds frustration instead, so use the checklist. In step 1, you're going to assign roles. There are 3 roles in a hexcrawl. These roles are Guide, Spotter, and Hunter. The Guide is in charge of making navigation checks, which can be either survival, investigation, or history, but history is rolled at disadvantage because knowing the terrain in theory is very different from knowing it in practice. So preferably you want your guide to have either high survival or high investigation. The Spotter needs high perception, and the Hunter needs high survival. Party members with no role assigned may assist party members with their roll checks, granting advantage on the check, but party members with a role assigned may not assist other party members with their rolls. So if you have a spare 4th party member, they could assist, say, the Guide, giving them advantage on their investigation check to navigate. But the Hunter can't assist the Guide because they're busy hunting. In step 2, you choose Bearing and Pace. Bearing is pretty straightforward. Every hex has 6 faces in the same set of directions. If you have true columns, those directions are going to be north, northeast, southeast, south, southwest, and northwest. The party picks one of those directions to head in. The pace the party can move at determines their speed. Each hex is 30 miles across and requires 30 speed to cross by default. However, some hexes require more than 30 speed to exit. We'll talk about that in step 3. A creature's strategic speed is equal to their tactical speed in feet. So most medium creatures can move 30 miles per day, some move 35, because their tactical speed is 30 feet per day, some move 35, etc. A party moves at the speed of its slowest member, but anyone riding a mount may use the mount's speed instead of their own. A party moving at a slow pace gets advantage on either their stealth check to avoid detection in step 8, or to their perception check to find the hex encounter in step 10, but not both, they have to pick one. They get advantage on their survival check to hunt in step 6 no matter what, and their movement speed is multiplied by 0.75. On the other hand, a party moving at fast speed gets disadvantage on their survival check to hunt in step 6, and their perception check in step 10, and they can't roll stealth in step 8 at all, but their movement speed is multiplied by 1.25. This allows parties to travel more cautiously or more quickly as the situation dictates, but most of the time the party is just going to move at a standard pace, which means step 2 is basically just choosing the bearing. Now in step 3, you will record speed loss from travel. You know what your speed is because you've set your pace. Every time you exit a hex, the party's speed is reduced by an amount depending on what kind of hex they're leaving. A standard grassland hex costs 30 speed to exit, which means when traveling across grassland hexes, a standard medium-sized creature with a 30-foot movement speed, and therefore a 30-mile strategic speed, will be able to leave one grassland hex every turn. If the party is moving with a fly speed instead of a land speed, they treat all hexes as being grassland hexes, regardless of their actual terrain, although they don't benefit from roads. Why use 30 miles as the default hex size? Well, there's several reasons. First of all, it means that all questions about how many hexes you can cover if you're riding a creature from the monster manual are immediately answered no matter what that creature is. Rather than plugging creature speeds into some complex equation, you just take their fastest relevant speed, and that is the number of miles they can travel in a day. Secondly, it converts very easily into maps that use the DMG's recommended size for kingdom or continent scale, while still having a hex be big enough to justify the process of walking through it. The DMG recommended kingdom scale be 6 miles per hex, small enough that you'd expect travelers to move multiple hexes in a single day, which is useful for troop movements when being 25% faster means actually covering an extra hex, but bad when you want each individual hex to include a major feature. It means drastically increasing the work required to populate a hex map, or else filling up the map with tons of empty hexes that are disappointing to enter. The continent scale is 60 miles per hex, so big that it would certainly take more than one day to move from one hex to another on foot, and requiring enormous speed boosts before you move noticeably faster. A 30-mile scale hex sits comfortably in between these two. 30-mile hexes are 5 hexes across in kingdom scale and half a hex across on continent scale. This means any hex map that uses either of those scales can be retrofitted to use Hexcrawl scale. But if you aren't using any official maps for the basis of a hexcrawl, or if you don't mind changing their scale significantly, it's justifiable to instead use 30-kilometer hexes, which is much closer to what you'd expect the average person to cover in a day, while also preserving the translation of tactical to strategic speed. The mechanics of the system are unchanged, although it does mean that you will need more hexes to cover the same physical area. A 6x6 hexcrawl would only cover an area the size of Belgium, and a 10x10 would only be the size of Portugal or Iceland, much smaller than Great Britain. In any case, in step 4, you're going to roll constitution saves, but usually you'll skip this step. If the party is out of speed but would very much like to leave the hex they're currently in before the end of the day, they can roll a constitution save for a forced march. For every hour of forced march, they add 0.1 to their speed multiplier for pace. So a slow pace goes from 0.75 to 0.85, standard pace from 1 to 1.1, and a fast pace from 1.25 to 1.35. When you force march, everyone must make a DC 10 Constitution save, plus 1 for each hour past the first. So DC 11 for the second save, DC 12 for the third, and so on. A character who fails the save must either take a level of fatigue or else fall behind. Characters may not take a long rest immediately after exiting a hex but before rolling for random encounters, or to spot the hex encounter, so any fatigue taken while traveling will continue to affect them during a random encounter, as well as during any hex encounter, although in the latter case the party can usually take a long rest before engaging with the hex encounter. Unless, of course, the hook for a hex encounter is something trying to murder you. If the characters are marching for an extra 9 hours, then there is no longer enough time in the day for them to take a long rest, unless they are elves, in which case they only need 4 hours of trance for a long rest, and it takes 13 hours of forced marching to prevent them from having one. A party who's forced march this long receives only a short rest when they finally go to sleep. Fortunately, all of this is fairly rare, since succeeding on 9 constitution saves in a row is really quite difficult in the first place. Now in step 5, the party guide will make a navigation check, and unlike step 4, you usually do have to do this one. But you can ignore this step if the party is following a road, a river, or some other landmark, or if they're moving directly towards some clearly visible landmark on the horizon like a mountain or a tower, on terrain flat enough to keep the landmark in constant or near constant view. In any of these cases, the party stays on course automatically. It's not hard to follow a river. If the party has insufficient speed to actually exit their hex this turn, you skip this step. If the party is exiting a hex, the guide must now roll survival, investigation, or, at disadvantage, history. The DC for this check varies based on terrain. Coastal, desert, and grassland terrain make this check at DC 10, Arctic forest, hill, mountain, and blue water terrain make this check at DC 15, and swamp and underdark terrain make this check at DC 20. You can find a whole lot more tables like this, by the way, in the written version of the guide. I'm only actually speaking aloud the ones where they are short enough so as to serve as an example of how terrains vary, because I'm not going to read off a whole big long table, like for example the table of how much speed it takes to get out of a hex, because the value for that is different on almost every single terrain type, of which there's about a dozen. In any case, if your navigation check succeeds, the party leaves the hex and enters the hex they intend to enter. But if that check fails, then the party veers. Roll a d20. On a 1 to 8, the party has veered left. For example, if they were going north on a map with true columns, they veer left and go northwest instead. If they are going south, a left veer would take them southeast. On a 13 to 20, the party veers right in the same way. On a 9 through 12, by sheer dumb luck, the party goes in the direction they intended. Either way, they are now lost. You keep track of what hex they're in, but they don't know. Now, in step 6, you mark off supplies, and maybe also the hunter rolled survival. The step is completed once per day, regardless of how many hexes the party travels through. So if the party hunter elects not to hunt in a hex, presumably in order to save his daily hunting for a hex with a lower DC, he cannot reverse that decision after leaving the hex if it turns out the hex you entered was much worse for hunting. So the party hunter will make a DC 15 survival check in coastal, forest, grassland, hill, and mountain terrain during spring, summer, or fall, DC 20 in any of those terrains during winter, or in a swamp or underdark terrain regardless of the season, and DC 25 in desert or tundra terrain. And note that some forests, grasslands, etc., are located in a climate that does not have winter, which means those areas will be DC 15 year-round. If the hunter succeeds on his check, the party does not have to mark off supplies for the day, because the hunter has gotten enough forage in order to feed them. However, there is not nearly enough time to properly store and preserve hunted or foraged supplies for long-term transport, so no amount of success will allow the hunter to increase the party's food supply. It can just prevent it from decreasing. If the hunter doesn't hunt any forage, then the party will have to mark off their supplies for the day. If the party goes hungry, everyone in the party takes a level of fatigue and does not gain the benefits of a long rest at the end of the day. Now in step 7, you enter the new hex. There's nothing to actually do in this step, but all steps from here on are made based on the hex the party has entered, not the one they were leaving. In step 8, the guide rolls stealth. If you're attempting to avoid direct detection, the guide rolls stealth and records the result for step 9, otherwise ignore the step. In step 9, there is a random encounter. You roll a random encounter on the random encounter table appropriate to the section of the hexcrawl the party is now in, and remember that the party has left the hex they were starting in and are now in the new hex. You compare the stealth check, if any, made in step 8 to the passive perception of the monster, if any, in the encounter. If the stealth check succeeds, the party has snuck up on the encounter. Otherwise, it's just a regular random wilderness encounter. Now in step 10, the spotter rolls perception to locate the hex encounter. Every encounter in a hexcrawl has a perception DC required to locate it, ranging from DC 5 for obvious things like castles on a grassland, up to DC 30 for incredibly well-hidden secret features. A single hex can even contain multiple encounters or features in it, each with different perception DCs. I don't really recommend this, but mainly just because hexcrawls take a lot of work to begin with, and you don't want to add on even more by putting more than one encounter in a single hex. During step 10, the spotter rolls a perception check and locates any hex feature or encounter that they meet or exceed the DC for. What the party does with that information is, of course, up to them. If the party is veered off course and become lost, spotting a landmark can often clue them in as to where they really are. Or maybe they'll assume there are 2 exact copies of the same landmark in different locations. How long you let them puzzle over this depends mostly on how funny you think it is watching them try to figure out how and why this village is in 2 places at once. In any case, that is Hexcrawls. It's gone on quite long enough already, so we are going to leave Urban Crawls for next time, whereupon we will also be covering Spheres of Influence, and that will actually be it. The next episode is going to be the final episode of my GM's Guide, but instead of regular, it's on YouTube. I'll see you there.